Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready for our final panel of the day. Thank you all, those of you who have been here all day, those of you who found your way over. We really appreciate you being here with us, and I'm excited to welcome the members of our final panel here, which is on mental health and reentry. So on the sequential intercept model brochure that you have at your tables, we're looking at intercept 4 primarily, but just like with all the panels, of course, there are connections to the other points in the continuum as well. We're going to begin with a quick introduction. So I'm Patricia O'Rourke, Research Associate with the Connecticut Sentencing Commission, and I'll allow the panelists now to introduce themselves.
My name is Benjamin Howell. I'm faculty at the Yale School of Medicine. I'm a general internist. I'm also faculty in the SACE Center for Health and Justice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Hines. I'm the Executive Director for Community Partners in Action.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. My name is Corey Betts, and I wear a couple of hats up here right now, so I'm going to tell you the first one, the one that pays me. I'm a director of Youth Challenge of Connecticut, which is a substance abuse program here in Hartford, and I'm also the president of the Greater Hartford branch of the NAACP and chair of criminal justice for the state conference of the NAACP. So thanks for having me.
And I'm Mark White. I'm a director with the Connecticut Judicial Branch Court Support Services Division.
Thank you. So I'm just going to begin with very brief opening remarks to set the context for what you'll be hearing from each of our panelists and the experience that they have in this field. In August 2023, SAMHSA published an evidence-based resource guide on best practices for successful reentry for criminal justice settings for people living with mental health conditions and/or substance use disorders. And they were looking at pre-release, at-release, and post-release, targeting the reduction in the recurrence of symptoms, overdose, and recidivism. In that report, they shared data from a 2019 study saying that individuals with either a mental health or substance use disorder diagnosis have a 4.1 times greater odds of experiencing incarceration in their lifetime. This increases to almost 7 times the odds for those with comorbid mental health and substance use disorders. To bring it home to our state in Connecticut, from the State of Reentry 2023 report released in February of this year by Career Resources, of the people incarcerated with an end-of-sentence date within 6 months, 34% had a moderate to severe mental health disorder. For community-supervised individuals, 62% statewide were identified as having a mental health diagnosis history, 21% of those individuals having moderate to serious mental health issues. For people incarcerated with sentences ending within 6 months, 94% reportedly had a substance use problem, of which 32% were classified as moderate and 50% as serious or extremely serious. And again, for individuals under community supervision, 89% were identified as having a substance use problem, 39% of those moderate, and 40% serious or extremely serious substance use. So that sets the context for the critical nature of this part of the continuum of reentry and the outcomes for individuals and our state. And so I'll turn it now over to our panelists, beginning with Dr. Ben Howell.
Thank you, Patricia. So actually one other, those are all important pieces of information that we think about as we consider sort of the population who's coming back to the community after being incarcerated. Those rates of substance use disorder and mental health issues are astronomically high and much higher than obviously the general population. And we know that over 90% of people who are incarcerated right now will return to the community, and it's not like those mental health conditions or substance use disorders go away. And if anything, I would say the process of reentering potentially exacerbates mental health symptoms and substance use disorders as they go through that process of trying to reintegrate into society, deal with paroles or gain gainful employment or gain housing, all the things that people need to address upon reentry. So I think it's absolutely, I think for me as a physician, we really think about reentry as the toxic exposure, sort of how do we measure that, is the risk of death following release from prison and jail is astronomically high. The risk of dying in the year after being released from prison is 12 times higher than the general population. The risk of being hospitalized is also significantly higher. The risk of dying is largely driven, especially early on, by overdoses, as well as suicide, as well as homicide, so things closely related to mental health and substance use disorders. Our group at Yale has been asked to lead a report by the Sentencing Commission to take a look at this, to take a look at the state of reentry and mental health treatment, building off the reports already generated by the Sentencing Commission documenting the high rates or high prevalence of mental health and substance use disorders in our incarcerated population. I wish I could be here to say that we actually have results to date, but that is, it has been a process getting there. But what we intend to do and are in the process of doing is doing two things. One, documenting, using that we know sort of the data from people coming out of the DOC who are on probation and parole, sort of identifying those individuals within how they're touching all the other agencies in the state, in particular mental health treatment services provided by or monitored by the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, as well as those billed to Medicaid or the Department of Social Services. So we're doing a quantitative project of seeing, like, looking at those cohorts of people coming back to the community from our prisons and jails and or on probation, looking over time, how are those people accessing mental health treatment that's available? How are they accessing substance use treatment that's available to them? And then trying to make a connection to sort of differences in treatment access or treatment utilization. How does that impact outcomes that are important to us? For the criminal legal population, oftentimes that's recidivism, so looking at rearrest, reincarceration. Me as a health professional, that's looking at hospitalization and other health outcomes. Obviously, there's a plethora of important outcomes to consider upon reentry, and we're hoping to get a hint at that looking at this data in the state. The second component is actually talking to people who are coming back, who are in the community, and hearing the stories about what was it like for people with mental health or substance use disorders when they wanted to access mental health services or addiction treatment services, and to hear those stories, to marry those stories with the data we see from the quantitative side. So that's where I wish I could say we had the results of that study, but I hope that that study largely informs the bigger picture of what's happening with this population as they're coming back.
Great, thank you very much. Beth?
So, like I said, I'm Beth Hines, and I'm from Community Partners in Action. The agency has provided services to adults and youth impacted by the justice system for almost 150 years. We were founded in 1875. Our focus has always been reentry. We operate a number of programs throughout the state of Connecticut, both inside the Department of Correction and in the community. We have a number of residential programs and non-residential programs, including the Reentry Welcome Centers in Hartford and in Waterbury. So over the years, I've been fortunate to be with CPA this is my 33rd year, and I've worked in a number of roles within the agency. I was appointed executive director in 2018, and what I can tell you from all that time with the agency is that I feel that at this time we're just at a critical stage in terms of the needs of the population that we serve. Seeing just the level of acuity in terms of substance abuse and addiction is just skyrocketed, especially since the pandemic. Many people coming to us, directly from the Department of Correction, often will be with us for a period of time and then decompensate, need to be connected to services in the community, and the wait list can be, several weeks to a month, which when somebody is using fentanyl or decompensating in such a significant way, time is of the essence, and we just can't wait that long. In terms of our residential programs, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of overdoses and the staff's use of Narcan. We've been fortunate that we have not lost more than 1 or 2 residents over the years. We've saved upwards of 40 residents' lives with Narcan. The programs, it's just like a constant state of being vigilant in terms of working with our residents. And I believe that most of the residents that are with us, it's a dual diagnosis. It's that morbidity of the substance abuse and the mental health challenges that they're dealing with. And Ben, you said it perfectly when we had a pre-meeting to today's panel, where when somebody comes out of incarceration, there's a level of trauma, regardless of it being mild, moderate, or severe. There is definitely a level of trauma. And if left unaddressed, it's just going to manifest itself. And unfortunately, we see that happen over and over again in many of our programs.
Thank you. Corey?
So to Ms. Hines' statement, and I have to be open and real. So the program in which I work for, I am also an alumni of that program, and I'm also just as involved. So when you see the gaps when it comes to substance abuse and mental health, you have individuals who don't even know that they're dealing with mental health issues, right? And we talk about reentry, and I know you guys have heard this 1,000 times. Reentry starts when an individual goes into these facilities. It doesn't start when they come out. It starts when they go in. So what type of services are being created to making sure that they are aware, for one, and then there's stigma when it comes to mental health issues. So what type of services are available so that they are aware that they're dealing with some real mental health issues, right? Because we talk about substance abuse, and for me, and working in these spaces, my understanding is the substance abuse is just 10% of the problem, right? There's another 90% of those underlying issues in which individuals are dealing with, and what they do in order to deal with those issues, they're using substances. So how do we create those spaces so that they'll understand that it's all right to feel that, right? And work through that so they don't have to go and deal with substances in these places, and there's stigma. It's not real, but it's, And the other part of it is understanding that it's all right to saying that I have a mental health issue. I believe all of us in this room have some mental health issues when it comes to losing a loved one. You don't just get over that type stuff, right? So just making it welcoming to understanding that it's all right to talk about issues in which we deal with, and let's deal with the elephant in the room. We all deal with issues, right? And I think it was someone who was up here earlier, the young man from CCAR, meeting people where they are, right? Because you don't want folks to feel alienated because they're dealing with a mental health issue. So I think just getting right at it and saying it's all right to feel, right? And that's my spiel, and I hope that, you experts would just dig in and meet people where they are and let them know it's all right to feel, and that, don't nobody wake up and say, I want to be an alcoholic or an addict, right? And finding out how did they get there. So thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Mark?
So my daughter humbled me a couple of years ago. My career spans over Connecticut and the state of New York, and I brought my kids and my wife to a ceremony where I was being recognized. And on the ride home, my daughter says to me, Dad, really? They really had to read that long bio? She said, Dad, they don't want to hear that. So I said, baby girl, what am I supposed to say? And she said, Dad, just tell them you like that Drake song. You started at the bottom and now you're here. So my name is Mark White, and I started at the bottom and now I'm here. So in terms of, lived experience, in 2015, I was heavily recruited by the state of New York because New York was looking for someone to come to help them with all the reform that we had achieved here in the state of Connecticut. And so I say recruited. Corey and I were just talking, more like a calling, right, to go to an environment where you knew no one, but there was work that needed to be done. My second month in the state of New York, and I was working in Albany, the governor's public safety department advised me that I needed to sit on a criminal justice reform panel. And if you don't know, in New York, right, you talk about Connecticut, 3.5 million people, New York, 19 million people. And when I say, can they get tumultuous, they can get tumultuous. And certainly they think they're better than everybody, so they couldn't stand this kid from Connecticut who kept saying, oh no, we did that 10 years ago. So I'm on this panel, and they read everyone's bio, and they're in the middle of the panel. The panelist next to me reaches out and puts her hand on my hand, and she whispers to me, I guess you couldn't save my son. Now, mind you, I hadn't met any of the other panelists. I'd only been in the state of New York for 2 months. So I just turned to her and said, ma'am, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss. So now I'm distracted, right, from what the remarks I wanted to say, because now I'm trying to figure out who she is, because we had never met. And as I'm fumbling through the program, I realize that this is Khalif Browder's mother. And if you haven't heard of Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old young male who was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack in New York City and spent 3 years at Rikers Island on a $3,000 bond. I've been to Rikers Island. Most eye-opening experience I've ever had, right? This young man was there for 3 years, and his mental health decompensated like you wouldn't believe. Depressive and extreme paranoia, right? So it really humbled me because I wasn't aware of his story, right? And the issues that we were facing in terms of addressing mental health in the system. You know, Malik Browder took his life in 2015. At the time, 16 and 17-year-olds were still treated as adults in New York State, which is a large part of why I went there, so I could tell them how great Connecticut was and how we did it so efficiently. The legislation didn't pass in 2016, didn't pass again in 2017. It finally passed in 2018, right? Believe it or not, in the state of New York, or New York City, you could go to Rikers Island for jumping a turnstile in the subway. It's horrible, right? Khalif Browder's mother passed in 2016. So I was there when the governor signed the raise the age legislation, right? We felt it was a big victory, but it was also a charge to say we need to do something about mental health services. So for me, that's always been a humbling experience that always keeps me focused on we could always do better. What I also wanted to share with you now that I've returned to Connecticut, so I came back to Connecticut in July of 2022 when I assumed overseeing adult probation operations. And so I've been in this role a little over a year and 3 months. And so some of the things our probation officers do in terms of reentry and mental health, we have specialized caseloads. So I have officers in every one of the 19 probation departments who engage in reentry planning. We start at about 120 days out where we begin reviewing the file. We have access to DOC information, right? Demographic information, discipline information. DOC also uses a mental health scaling, right? 5 being the most severe, 1 being not that severe. And so my folks gather all this information. Around between the 60 to 90 day mark, my folks will do a virtual interview and assessment with individuals who are still incarcerated. So we're preparing them for when they leave. In that conversation, we'll talk about housing, we'll talk about medication needs, if there are any, and then we conduct our risk assessment tool, right? So we can begin preparing to make sure these individuals are supported when they come out. So we'll make those connections. If they don't have insurance, we'll actually do the Husky D application for them to ensure that they're tied to insurance when they come out. And so we begin those efforts. At the same time, we have a specialty unit of mental health officers, right, who are trained. They have CAP caseloads, ratios of 25-to-1, where they work with individuals who have a mental illness, right? And those could be people with an Access 1 or 2 diagnosis. You know, it could be individuals that were deemed a level 4 or 5 by the Department of Corrections. It could be individuals on that psychiatric security review board. that Dr. Norco was mentioning. And those, if you've had those interactions, that would automatically make you eligible for the mental health unit. And so lastly, I'll just say, once we've done those complete assessments, right, and then once individuals get out, we require that they report immediately. If they aren't involved in services, we will refer them to services immediately. We do a little bit more additional intake and assessment information, and then we are very fortunate that we have a lot of services available to us that we can refer our clients to. And so ideally, could we get better? Absolutely. I can tell you one of the areas that we're a little challenged with are young people coming out of MYI, and we're trying to do a better job of wrapping our hands around them before they get out. They need to be supported, right, in a different way, and I think we're trying to figure out how we can engage them a little bit better, right, so that they don't find themselves going back down the path that led to them coming into the system.
Thank you very much. I was going to return to some of the comments you all said earlier, but I think I'd like to stay with what Mark just offered there and ask the three of you for your thoughts on that population, in particular our young people.
Wow, the younger generation. So for me and what I'm thinking, because the stigma with mental health, and when you start engaging with the youth, again, I'm all about meeting individuals where they are. So my thought is always like a performing arts or some artsy stuff to get in their attention, and once you're able to get their attention, now you can work on the problem. But if you're not able to get their attention to drawing them into what is or what may interest them, then we just kicking a can, right? We just talking, and it was a comment someone made earlier, as far as having individuals who are impacted by these issues to be a part of the conversation so that you can get their buy-in as well. You need them to be at the table as well to saying, what is it that you need, right? So now that I'm giving you those services and what you're saying you're needing, it ain't no excuse now. So now I can really hold you accountable because I made sure that those resources were available for you. So my thing is always performing arts, though, because it's arts, right? Arts is another way of therapy, so allowing them to express themselves in however way they feel can benefit them.
So our experience at Community Partners in Action is with our residential programs, our residential treatment programs for male youth. We operate a staff secure program in Hartford and a site secure program in Hamden. All of the needs of the youth are provided on site at the program. And I was lucky enough to be down there actually this week on Monday, and I sat in one of the groups, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is the milieu of the program. And the topic of the conversation that the youths had were on pros and cons. And in that short time that I was with the youth, which was just about a half hour, the trauma that came across through the conversations that they were bringing forward about pros and cons were so significant. Trauma as to what they were missing out on while they were with us in Hamden. Trauma regarding being in Hamden and knowing that your friend was murdered. Just so much trauma. We're lucky that we have Yale Behavioral Health on site for our kids, so they have access to 24/7 clinical care. But some of these kids are 13 years old, 14, and the trauma that they have experienced is I think, unimaginable for most of us.
Yeah, I don't think I have a particular deep insight into this question because it's a crucial and important question. But I do always like to reflect, instead of focusing on the individual, the youth in front of you, so what is the context of how they've been to reach that point? Because there's so many things like, yes, they have symptoms of mental illness, they have symptoms of a substance use disorder or actively using substances or other issues, but what are all the things around them that sort of led them to that point? So what is their family dynamic? What is their community dynamic? What are the opportunities that are available to them? Sort of what are the role models that they have in their community? Sort of how do we situate the person? How did they reach that point? Like, how did they get there? What were all the things that failed them to get to that point? Because I think if we just say, like, we got to deal with this person in front of us without sort of without acknowledging that larger dynamic of all these systems that have potentially failed these kids, and trying to, I mean, that's a heavy lift to say, how do we fix all those systems? But I think if we're just sort of dealing with the problem in front of us and not sort of looking back at the larger dynamic, we might just continually be dealing with this problem.
All right, that also connects to, Corey, you made the comment about that we can't hear it enough, that reentry begins when you enter, not at the end. And Ben, you used the word exacerbate in terms of the situation people find themselves in that critical point of transition. So I would ask each of you if you would reflect and share more with us with what do you see about that particular time in one's life and that transition, and anything else you'd want to share about what's important, the challenges that are there, and what opportunities would we have to make that transition a more successful one.
You know, we talk about mental health, and you know, I said again, reentry starts when an individual goes in, right? So you may have an individual who may never have had a mental health issue, but once you take their freedom away, right, that's creating some mental health issues, whereas though I'm not able to talk to my family every day, or I can't move the way I'm usually moving. That's some mental health stuff. So how is it, and making sure when that happens, especially in the inside, that someone is acknowledging that piece of it and saying, okay, there's something going on with this individual, and I think we need to tap into him and start talking to him, because again, he has to come back, or she has to come back out into the community. And if we don't address this issue right now, it's just going to be a continuation when they go back out. And this is where you get recidivism at, right? Because again, you done created something within that space. Now it's coming out, and those resources that are supposed to be with them outside of those walls aren't there. So how do you make sure you bridge that gap, and making sure once they get in, they have those resources wrapped around them, and then once they get out, the same resources are following them. Like, how do we make sure those type things happen, right? So I think that's important.
So as I mentioned earlier, Community Partners in Action operates the Hartford Reentry Welcome Center, and we actually just received the final version of our Year 4 evaluation. And so actually speaks to what you're talking about. So it's good that I actually pulled this out, right, and even highlighted it. So the study found that the amount of time between leaving prison and attending the Hartford Reentry Welcome Center was related to new arrests. Participants were much less likely to be arrested if they attended the center within 2 weeks after their release from prison. The study goes on to say that a key finding in the evaluation was that the Reentry Welcome Center participants who were engaged within 2 weeks of returning to their communities were significantly more likely to be successful and remain crime-free compared to those who were engaged after 2 weeks. And so what that says specifically supports your point that the pre-release service component is just so critical, right? So people need to know before they're released where they can go to get the help that they need, given the fact that those first 2 weeks beyond release are so critical. And so that's why we've been able to work with the Department of Correction for anybody that's returning to the reentry welcome centers across the state of Connecticut, that they're actually brought right to the center on the day of release by the department. And we're waiting for them and ready for them to serve what the needs that they have. So that's really important. And the study actually supports what you're saying. So thank you.
I guess I don't have a lot to add other than, like, it's great. What I would hope to see when we are able to finally finish our study is to hear sort of these stories about the Hartford Reentry Center, sort of the programs that CSSD is providing, other programs in our state, sort of get a better sense of like which programs are working, which programs potentially there's opportunities to address those needs. Because I think that you hear these stories like our program's working great, we're doing these things, or CSSD is doing these things, but we don't have a great overall sense of what is working and what is not working. So that's my hope, is to hear, I mean, as a researcher and sort of big picture person, to get a sense, to move from like, we have these various pieces happening in the state or various entities that we think are working well, to get a bigger picture of sort of how reentry services are happening, how we're doing the warm handoff, how we're doing the pre-release services and the post-release sort of things as well. I mean, I've heard it a couple times, like we refer people to services, but we don't have a great sense of like, are those services readily used? Are those services readily available? Because a referral is only good as the services that people are actually able to engage with, and to manage all those social needs that we know are going to, have an impact on someone's success after they reenter, let alone their mental health.
I think they covered it pretty good. I agree, with the need to be able to engage people in services very timely. And so when I mentioned that example of the young people coming out of MYI, one of the things we've been exploring is actually having the program we made a referral to do a virtual intake as well. So it's not just my officers doing an intake and getting an information, but that when you come out, now you don't have to wait to go to the program to do an intake, it's done. And now you can just go to the program and hopefully begin your services. And so, that whole concept, came about because we realized the need to make sure folks got connected to interventions timely. My probation officers do attend all the reentry roundtables across the state. We like to partner with other folks, right? Because we realize we need help to be able to better support the population we're trying to serve.
Thank you. We've heard the word trauma many times throughout the day, and already on this panel here, both the trauma people experience before they become entangled with the criminal legal system, the trauma that is compounded when you are within it. And so I was just wondering if there's anything that any of you would want to add about how are we addressing trauma and reentry in Connecticut? What challenges do you see there? What approaches or strategies are working, and what else could we be thinking about going forward?
It was something that Doc said as far as how did individuals get there, right? We have to always go to how did they get there. There was an analogy that I was taught by one of my mentors, and just say me and Beth, we're walking down the road and there's a baby floating. So me and Beth, we jump in the water, we save the baby. Then another one comes. We jump in and we save that baby. Then another one comes, and Beth looks at me and say, Corey, I am not jumping in that water with you. I'm like, what do you mean? We got to save this baby. I'm not jumping in that water with you, Corey. Like, we have to save this baby. I said, so what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go up the hill and find out who's throwing these babies in the water. So I say that to say we have to get to the root of it in order to fix this. We cannot continue to keep kicking the can. There's real issues, especially in the communities in which I serve. I serve the Black and brown communities. So when we talk about trauma, we have to also talk about the Maslow hierarchy of law, right? Basic needs, right? You have food deserts in these communities. So if you're not addressing that, these are some issues that are never going to get addressed, because you got some folks who don't even know where their next meal coming from, let alone where they're going to sleep at. So we have to make sure we start addressing those issues, especially, again, in these urban communities where when we look at economic development and infrastructure is so weak, these issues will continue to have trauma and all these other type of things connected to it. And not just that, and we're talking about the younger generation, and I would think about when I was growing up and you see yellow tape, and if no one is talking about the yellow tape that these young kids have to step over and saying this isn't the right way to live, they're thinking this is a normal way of living, and no one is speaking to that. So now they start engaging in those acts. So I think it's very important that we get to the root of it and start speaking to these issues, letting them know like this isn't the right way for individuals to be living in these communities. So, thank you.
I just wanted to remind everyone that homelessness and housing insecurity is a significant need of the reentry population, which just compounds the challenges that they face. At the centers, I can't tell you how many people come to us who are homeless or housing insecure. It's like Ken tell you, I mean, we know the stats, it's upwards of 50% of people that are street homeless. At our residential program, so many men don't have a place to go when they leave us. They often will discharge to a shelter, sometimes to the streets. We were able to open a reentry home in Hartford this past June, which is fantastic, but we can only serve 9 men at a time in that home. So just please keep that in mind as we're talking about mental health and substance abuse. Homelessness is right up there with that whole scenario.
And to that point, so I do an initiative every Wednesday in the north end of Hartford called Wake Up Wednesday, and I'm in Unity Plaza. And the purpose of me doing this was to look and to bring resources to the people, because there's a lot of resources that are available for individuals in these communities, but they don't even know about them, right? That's one piece of it. But to Beth's point, I'm out there, and every time I'm out there, someone is looking for housing. But that's one part of it, right, or jobs. But if we're not addressing the real core issues, you can get them apartments, you can get them jobs, but if their mental health isn't stable, they're not going to be able to sustain that type stuff. So we have to make sure those wraparound services are connected to housing and jobs as well, right? So I think that's very important to definitely share.
I totally agree. I think those are all amazing points about the trauma that both sort of precede sort of people entering the criminal legal system in the communities that they live in, as well as the trauma on reentry. I mean, we would be remiss to not mention the trauma of being incarcerated themselves, and sort of there is an opportunity. Like, prisons and jails don't have to look the way they do. They don't need to function the way they do. There are opportunities to rethink the way we incarcerate people, or if we have to incarcerate people, to expose them to that. I don't pretend to know what the answer is, but I think the onus is on us to say, like, we need to rethink the way these systems work if they are potentially causing harms and not benefiting society as a whole. One other thing I'll say is, like, all these things are a great idea, but we do also need to acknowledge as a state, like, this costs a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Like, so not only does it cost a lot of money to incarcerate someone, but imagining, like, what does it look like to have, you know, supportive housing, plus someone who may not be able to work, like, how do you financially support them? All these things that, like, are really cost a lot of money, and I would say sometimes the appetite isn't there for policymakers to use money to fund those opportunities, even if we were able to argue that it would benefit our society. So absolutely we need to be doing things, but it really is going to cost dollars and cents and real hard sort of questions about, like, well, no, these are some of the people who are otherwise highly stigmatized by our population, by our society in general, like, but yet we need to be putting a lot of resources into them to maximize the benefit.
I still think it would be cheaper than incarcerating them.
From that point, I'd like to go back to the topic of diversion. And as it was mentioned earlier, diversion can happen at different points in the continuum of entanglement with the criminal legal system. And one of the strategies that was talked about earlier today was peer support, peer recovery coaches. So I'd just like to give you all an opportunity, anybody who has a program or experience related to that, anything you want to share specific to reentry in the sense of diversion from the more engagement with the system.
Wow. So I guess that'd be me, being that I'm working in a substance abuse program, right? But again, right, I work with individuals who, and I see great changes in their lives when they do have those supports, right? So I am the director of second phase, which is the transitional piece of our program, where individuals are able to go out, but they still have to do, instead of 20 hours a week of treatment, only 4 hours, and they're able to work, go to school, and just really, you know, enforcing that. And my biggest thing in working with these individuals, for one, is letting them know the importance of accountability, right? Because a lot of times, some of these individuals who especially come into our facility, they never had no accountability. They ain't never had no structure. So how do you make sure you create that? So when they do leave, because my biggest thing is you have to leave up out of here. So let me make sure that I reinforce whatever needs you need right now. Whether it's a job, making sure you're sustaining a job, you have a bank account, and that's another piece of it, right? Some folks don't even have financial literacy to even be able to, pay a bill. They never paid a bill. So how do you make sure you create that in those spaces? And the peer support is definitely major. Like we do something every Wednesday, whereas though those who have completed our program, we have a Zoom link for them to come on, and it's called Celebrate Recovery, whereas though you have individuals who have gone through the program who's doing very well for themselves, and you can see that. And again, I told someone earlier, unfortunately, we live in a society where as though we have to see it to believe it. So let them see that there's individuals who have had some challenges in their lives, and they're overcoming those challenges. And one thing that I share with the guys in the program is this: it's good to, tap into your therapist and your counselor. That's great. But to be able to be in your group settings and to share one another's stories and allowing to see what challenges I may have that you may be afraid to share. You can hear my challenges. Now you're open to sharing that. Now we're having real conversation on what's going on with each other, and it helps us to move forward in this process of recovery, I believe.
Anyone else?
I guess I got to jump in again at some point, huh? First, I would say that I'm a huge supporter of diversion. I think diversionary programs are very, very important. But I also think, as a state, we talk about a lot of the things we do great, and two things have always been a concern to me. The first, Corey hit on it. While we've made a lot of reductions in our system, it still remains a fact that the deeper you go, the blacker and browner it gets. And so we still need to be focused on that and why that's happening and what we could be doing differently. And the other thing I think is, we tend to have a tendency to treat the person and not treat the behavior. And so we tend to label people as a bad person, and it doesn't mean that they were a bad person. What they did may have been bad, right? But we tend to kind of label them as an individual, that you're a bad person, and then we're going to treat you that way for the rest of your life. And I think we could do better in that because people make mistakes. People need second opportunities. And so I think diversion is a way to help that. But I also think, continuing to label folks the way we do in our state and even nationally is not helpful. And I think we could do a better job of that, right? And again, it's treating the behavior and not the person. And it seems like we treat the person. The one thing I did want to say, I didn't jump in on the trauma piece, but I did want to say I agree, with the panel, and these folks are great up here, that we definitely have to get at the core issue and treat the trauma, right? And for me, I always normalize that in, about 15 years ago, I remember getting rear-ended, right? Minor accident, what have you. For the next 9 months, I couldn't get out of my rearview mirror. I kept thinking somebody was going to hit me, right, based on that small exposure. And I didn't get hurt, right? But for me, that kind of always keeps me focused on, like, wow, when you look at adverse childhood experiences and you look at what some people have experienced who come into contact with the system, it's magnitude to a level unlike anything I've ever experienced. And so I do think we have to remain focused on that as well.
I did want to sort of weigh in on your question about peer support services. I think there's a lot of potential. I mean, people will tell you anecdotally, like, that was the key for me getting on the right path, sort of having someone with lived experience who was maybe farther ahead than me to sort of help guide me and sort of teach me and mentor me through the process. We at Yale have a transitions clinic model that is very much based in that, with the community health worker being a person with lived experience. My caveat to that is sometimes, like, what does that look like? I will say sort of groups will say, we have peers, we have coaches, we have community health workers. That can look like a lot of different things in a lot of different places. So I think we should be rigorous and be like, this is what, especially if we're going to use resources, money, to support these type of programs, we should be clear, like, what does it actually look like? What are we actually trying to, what is that intervention that we're actually doing? And is there fidelity of that intervention across different settings? Let alone sort of rigorously evaluating, is that actually effective? Because I think for some people that'll be the key, but one size doesn't fit all, and is like, on average, is it actually moving the needle or not? So I think there's opportunity, there's potential for thinking about the ways of using the knowledge and expertise of people with lived experience to help people, their other people in their communities sort of on the reentry process, but we should be rigorous and thoughtful about how we do it.
Thank you all. I'd like to invite the audience to bring their questions to you. You all bring a wealth of experience and information that we can share, so I'm just looking around for the mics.
Hi there. My name is Amber. I'm with Restorative Action Alliance, and I just wanted to ask, because we've talked a lot about like trauma and things that people have experienced while they were incarcerated or when they interacted with the system. And it seems like there is this pathologizing of the trauma. Like, let's just call it what it is. When people are incarcerated, they're put in cages, they're dehumanized. A normal reaction would be to have reactions to that. And so this idea that, yes, there is mental health that is being created from that, but it's like the babies, right? We're creating it, and then we're like, now let's get a solution to that. So I think to some of the things that you guys were talking about, how do we look at that? And then how do we ride the line between treatment, coercion, and systems that are meant to help getting in the way of forward movement? And what I mean by that is there are some types of treatment that are attached to the system that are very coercive. There are some barriers that are placed in front of people in terms of employment, housing, things like that when they're on supervision. So I just wanted to sort of lay that out and get thoughts on that. And thank you.
Yeah, all they heard in what you said was supervision.
That's Mark.
Yeah, I would agree that there could be some challenges, right? In terms of probation, a lot of times we're trying to operate within conditions that were ordered by the court. And so, there are some occasions where that probably could conflict, with treatment. But I think for the most part, we're very progressive, right? I find people coming up to me more saying, how many chances are you going to give somebody before you try to violate them, than I hear people saying you guys violate too much. And so I think to the extent we can, we really try to work with people and try not to create barriers to treatment. But if there are certain conditions that kind of get in the way of that, I think it's something I could take another look at, because I don't think that's what our intention is. I think the intention is, we want to see folks get involved in services and receive the treatment they need. I always tell people, you drive by a probation department, we don't have a sign that says open for business. And so, folks not coming to us is not something I think any of us have an issue with, and we want to see the system continue to shrink. But I have to go back and look at that and give that some more thought in terms of, our role, and do we in fact sometimes impede treatment during the course of us trying to supervise individuals involved with us.
I'll just add, I think that's a great question, both sides of your question, both sort of like not over-medicalizing what is fundamentally a system that we think is creating harm, and not to say like, oh, this is the status quo, we've created this harm, now we call it PTSD and we deal with it, to acknowledge that and to not lean, to be careful when we're thinking about that. On your point about The supervision, absolutely. I mean, I think there's sometimes opportunity to lean into sort of mandates or surveillance is the key to sort of figuring out how to address some of these issues. And I think that can be like I don't know what the best way, I think that can lead to more problems, that if we over-surveil people, we require people to do certain treatments, it just sets them up for failure, and they're not doing the things that they need to be doing, I think, to lead a successful life. So that we can, I mean, there's good data that, like, if people are in, if they're over-surveil them, they're more likely to end up back in the system as opposed to being successful otherwise.
I think one thing, if y'all don't mind, real quickly, and this is what we do, and I know you guys may have heard of the motivational interviewing, right? So how do we, you know, affirm and support, right? And saying, you know, because a lot of times we look at the bad part of things, right? And we tell a person how bad they are, right? And I think in those type of situations, instead of telling them how bad they are, this is what can happen for you. I can remember having a counselor, right? And she's my go-to gal now, Dr. Sweets Wilson. And I would go see her. And when I was involved in, you know, the justice system, you know, there were partners that she worked with, and she asked me this question, and it just changed the way my thinking was. She says, everybody is telling me what they think you need. What is it that you need? And now is that buy-in, because now I have to take responsibility for what I really need. It ain't no trying to go out the back door, the side door, because now is a reality. This is what I know I need. So now I'm a part of that process instead of that process being shoved down my throat, I believe. So I think that helps, if that answers it.
Thank you for your information. It's much appreciated. I'm Rep. Johnson. I wanted to just add that yesterday I was with a conference of municipalities for disaffected youth. And I would really like to, when you were talking about the babies being tossed into the river there, I was thinking this would be a good place for people to connect with the fact that we have limited access to special education in our school systems. Every single school is different in terms of how it addresses special education. Our funding is very limited, and when you put the homeless shelters and all the people with low incomes and say Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New Haven, what we do is we limit their access to special education because of the way that it's funded. And so these children are growing up in homeless shelters, getting post-traumatic stress disorder from the being placed in homeless. Our social safety net is the second worst in the country. I've been working on that since I got to the Capitol. We are the only state that gives you 21 months and you're off, TANF, and now we've gotten to 36 months effective April 2024. So this is part of the problem that we're seeing in terms of the children that are suffering and growing up in these situations and not having faith in society. And so if we could work together with what you're doing here and take a look at what the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities is doing to try and fix that. We also have a working group right now on special education to standardize special education for the entire state, so that we don't run into these problems anymore. And then we have to take a look at how we fund it, because the formula hasn't changed since Meskel was the governor. So I think that there is a lot of things that we know now about behavioral health that I didn't know in 1974, and that we need to be able to apply all the things that we've learned in the last 40 years or so to the discharge of people who have been incarcerated, and try and figure out exactly what it is that needs to happen to make sure that they have a place to live. The other thing that I could mention is the fact that we used to have something called state-assisted general assistance, which provided housing, paid rent, paid utilities for people on a short-term basis. And then that was eliminated in the 90s, and it created a situation where we have all these homeless people now So the temporary assistance for needy families being the worst in the country, second worst in the country, and also not having state-assisted general assistance anymore, so people can have a place to live and pay the rent and have utilities and food. These are the things that have created this homeless crisis. That I worked at legal services back in the 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s, and we didn't have those problems then. We didn't have those problems till we reformed welfare as we knew it back in the day. And so I think that these are things that the Sentencing Commission might want to look at in terms of working with the Human Services Committee at the Capitol, and trying to make sure that we have access to resources for everybody in the state like we used to have. Thanks so much for all your work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for your comments. What you said about education and housing certainly connects to the points that were brought up here, that mental health and basic needs and all of those things go together.
Could I just say one thing to your point? So again, and this is just my theory, when we talk about criminal justice reform, if we're not talking about education reform, we cannot talk about criminal justice reform. So thank you.
Yeah, I would like to thank you both for your comments. So to push us on the panel, push us as a state to not accept the status quo and to not pat ourselves on the back. There are things that can change and should change. Some of those happen at the federal level. Obviously, welfare reform didn't happen in Connecticut. That happened in Washington. Before my time, but your point about sort of what within the leeway that we have within Connecticut, services that we can provide like TANF and SNAP and housing support, like why are we not pushing the needle to provide more, let alone sort of what the federal government will allow too.
Federal level allows 60 months. The state only allows 21 months.
So exactly, why aren't we not pushing ourselves to the limit of what the I agree. So to be very clear about sort of what the state is doing well and what it is not doing well compared to what is within the limit of a possible within state federal programs like TANF, SNAP, and Medicaid. I mean, I do think there are opportunities. I mean, I think we should maximize sort of what we can do to provide a social safety net beyond what we do now. As I said to my point before, that's going to cost money. And I think in the current political environment, I am not a politician, but it feels like in the current political environment, that might be a hard sell in Connecticut. Not to say that we shouldn't push for that and not to change that, but I am worried that the winds, as far as expanding the footprint of the Connecticut state government and how much money we spend, would be a hard fight. Not to say it's not a fight we shouldn't have, but it is something to acknowledge.
We could take one more question.
All right, thank you. Yeah, my name is Thomas Burr. I'm the Public Policy Manager for the Connecticut chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. One of our 4 core things that we do as an organization is legislative advocacy. So I want to first thank everyone, the panelists and everyone here for being here, because the only way we're going to get the system to change in a positive manner is to have our voices heard up at the Capitol. I also want to thank you specifically, Mr. Corey Betts, for being a peer and the work that you do. I think you hit some really good points, and I think the role of peers is one of the secret sauces, one of the keys that I don't think is fully appreciated in too many spots. Now, the interesting thing is that our Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services has trained literally hundreds of peers. However, they have no mechanism to get paid. What a wasted resource. So that's something we should be fighting for up at the Capitol. Because again, meeting people where they are and giving them agency is huge. So thank you for talking about that. The other thing that I just want to say really quickly is that the A in NAMI stands for Alliance. If you're not involved up at the Capitol, we are. Join us. And if you are involved or you want to get involved but you don't know how to do it, we train people. So if anyone's interested, I'll be here. With that, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Would any of the panelists like to make any final remarks?
Just get involved. Meet people where they are. Don't be afraid. And as I always say, don't nobody wake up and say that they want to have mental health issues or they want to be addicted to drugs, right? So just meet people where they are and let them know that their voice do count. You know, to the young lady who's leaving, we were a part of that, nothing about us without us. So again, making sure that those individuals who are impacted by substances or mental health, that you have them at the table so that they can share their experience, so that, you know, one can advocate, and not just that one can advocate, but you can empower them to advocate for themselves, because whose story is more powerful than the ones who have been directly impacted by these issues? So I think that's very important. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I know everybody is probably, I know everybody's probably anxious to start hitting the road and beating the traffic. I want to thank all of you so much for being here today. It's so important for us to also hear the feedback, and that's one of the things I would just like to leave you with, is that even if you did not want to raise your hand and speak out today in this forum, please reach out to us. It is essential in terms of our hearing some of the different issues and approaches that we might be able to, in some small way, implement. I think it's very clear to everybody that this is not a quick fix. There are many different layers to it, and we have to take each one apart. But obviously, we want to be able to do that. One of the things that I thought, while it was comical and it was a comic moment, but it was also really significant, was in the last panel where Bill and Kevin were up here, each representing very diverse aspects. One the public defenders, one the state's attorney's office, and when they really sat down and heard what the other one was saying, they looked at each other and said, okay, done. You know, we kind of have come to a realization that there are many things that we can agree on. You know, some of these panels in years past, people have been on very different sides. But when we break it down here, I'm not saying we're going to agree on everything, but it was surprising how many things people did agree on. And I think we all agree that this is a very important and critical topic. So thank you so very much for being here. We appreciate your presence. Thank you.